Hello everyone, welcome to the Story Tales, your place for the best horror stories. For the next hour, I want you to put on your earphones, put your phone face down, and close your eyes. Relax, and let this story take you to a world full of chills and mystery. I've been listening to horror stories for years, and now I'm here to share the most amazing ones with you. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The drive to Willow Creek had been uneventful. The long stretch of road flanked by rolling fields and clusters of trees that seemed to whisper secrets to the wind. I had left behind the towering city skyline, trading it for this rural patch of quiet in the hopes of starting fresh. Life had thrown more at me in the past few years than I could handle. Failed relationships, a job that felt like a trap, and the overwhelming cacophony of urban life pressing in on all sides. The house came into view as I turned down a narrow gravel path, the tires crunching softly under the weight of my truck. It was a modest structure, painted a faded white that peeled in a few places. The roof sagged slightly, and the porch steps creaked under my tentative weight when I stepped out to inspect it. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I could already see the charm hidden beneath its weathered exterior. A garden overgrown with weeds hinted at a once-loved space, and the old barn in the distance stood as a reminder of the land's farming history. This was a place with stories, a quiet witness to years gone by. Unloading my few belongings didn't take long. The movers had already dropped off the bulk of my things earlier in the week, leaving me with just a few personal items to carry in. I set up the essentials, a bed, a small table, and a chair, and then took a moment to breathe it all in. The air smelled different here, cleaner. I leaned against the porch railing, watching the sun dip lower in the sky, casting golden hues across the field. That's when I first noticed it. At the far edge of the property, near the barn, a figure slumped awkwardly among the tall grass. My heart skipped for a moment before my brain caught up. A scarecrow. I walked closer, curious. The thing looked like it had been thrown together in a hurry, its frame leaning precariously, one arm hanging lower than the other. The face was particularly odd. Someone had used a burlap sack, drawing two black circles for eyes and a red line for a mouth. The line was jagged and uneven, giving it a crooked, unsettling grin. The clothes were no better. Tattered overalls and a faded plaid shirt, both too small for the wooden frame that barely held them together. Stray bits of straw poked out at odd angles, and one of its shoes was missing entirely. I chuckled, shaking my head. It was pathetic, really. Who even used scarecrows anymore? I assumed it was left over from a previous owner, abandoned to the elements like the rest of the property. Still, it gave me an idea. The next day, after spending the morning unpacking and arranging furniture, I decided to do something about the sad scarecrow. I didn't have much experience with gardening or farming, but I figured sprucing it up couldn't hurt. After all, I wanted this place to feel like home, and little touches like a proper scarecrow could make all the difference. I found some old paint in the barn, along with a few scraps of fabric. The barn itself was a relic, its wooden beams sturdy despite years of neglect. Dust motes danced in the sunlight streaming through cracks in the walls, and the air smelled of earth and aged wood. I spent hours there, crafting a new face for the scarecrow. This time I painted bright blue eyes and a cheerful smile, hoping to banish the unsettling aura of its previous design. When I was satisfied, I hauled the newly refurbished scarecrow to the center of the field. The sun was high overhead, casting sharp shadows as I worked. The ground was firm, and I had to use a spade to dig a deep enough hole to anchor the post. By the time I finished, sweat dripped from my forehead, and my arms ached, but I felt accomplished. I stepped back to admire my work. The scarecrow stood tall now, its head held high, arms outstretched as if embracing the open sky. It was silly, but I felt a small swell of pride. It was a simple thing, but it made the field feel less empty. less forgotten. The rest of the day passed without incident. I spent the afternoon exploring the property, taking note of the overgrown garden beds near the house and the small pond hidden beyond a cluster of trees. As the sun began to set, the landscape transformed, bathed in warm amber light. I made a mental note to bring my camera out here sometime. That night, as I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The stars were brighter here, unspoiled by city lights, and the silence was profound. Occasionally, the distant chirp of crickets or the hoot of an owl broke the stillness, but it was comforting rather than intrusive. From my vantage point, I could see the scarecrow standing guard in the field. It seemed smaller in the moonlight, almost blending into the swaying grass. I smiled to myself, feeling a flicker of contentment. As I headed to bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was the right choice. Willow Creek might not have been much to look at, but it offered something I desperately needed: a chance to start over. Morning arrived with the soft hum of life awakening around the property. Birds sang in cheerful harmony, and the light of dawn painted everything in warm tones of orange and pink. It was my first full day in Willow Creek, and I intended to make the most of it. After a quick breakfast, I grabbed my work gloves and stepped outside. The to-do list in my head was already growing: clear the overgrown garden beds, fix the loose porch step, and start figuring out how to maintain the field. Owning property was a bigger responsibility than I'd anticipated, but I felt ready to dive in. I started with the garden. The weeds were relentless, their roots tangled and deep, but there were signs of life beneath the mess. As I worked, I unearthed remnants of past planting, wilted tomato vines, the skeletal remains of what might have been sunflowers, and even a cluster of carrots that had stubbornly survived despite years of neglect. The morning passed in quiet labor. By noon, I'd cleared enough of the garden to reveal a few patches of soil ready for planting. Wiping sweat from my brow, I decided to take a break. I grabbed a sandwich from the kitchen and settled on the porch, my gaze naturally drifting toward the scarecrow. It stood exactly where I'd left it, a silent sentinel over the field. Its new face, bright and cheerful, almost made it look alive. As I ate, I couldn't shake a strange thought. Yesterday, the scarecrow had seemed like just another project, something to fix up and forget about. Today, though, it felt different. Its presence was noticeable. I dismissed the thought as a product of my overactive imagination and the quiet of my new surroundings. After lunch, I decided to explore the barn more thoroughly. There was something fascinating about its old-world charm, the way it seemed frozen in time. The heavy doors groaned in protest as I pushed them open, and a faint smell of hay and wood greeted me. Inside, sunlight filtered through the cracks in the walls, casting long streaks of light across the dusty floor. Tools hung on the walls, many of them rusted but still serviceable. A large wooden ladder led to a loft above, and a few bales of hay were stacked neatly in one corner. I found myself drawn to the loft. Climbing carefully, I discovered a collection of old items: crates filled with faded photographs, yellowed newspapers, and even a few children's toys. It was like stepping into someone else's life, a window into the past of this place. One box caught my attention. Inside were journals, their leather covers cracked and worn. I opened the first one and flipped through its pages. The handwriting was neat, precise, and the entries dated back decades. Planted corn today. Weather looks promising. I hope the scarecrow does its job this time. The scarecrow. Curious, I scanned more entries. It seemed the previous owners had a particular fondness for it, referring to it often as our guardian. One passage gave me pause. Strange noises last night. Thought it was coyotes at first, but the dog wouldn't stop barking. Checked the field this morning. Nothing missing, but the scarecrow was leaning to one side, like it had moved. I shivered despite myself, telling myself it was just a story. The field outside was quiet, serene. It was hard to imagine anything sinister about it. Still, The entry nagged at me. I tucked the journal under my arm and climbed back down, determined to read more later. By evening, I had worked up a sweat repairing the porch step and organizing the barn tools. The day had been productive, and I felt accomplished, though tired. As the sun began its descent, I found myself drawn back to the field. The scarecrow looked the same as it had all day, but something about it still felt off. Its bright blue eyes seemed to catch the light differently now, almost glowing in the dimming sun. I chalked it up to fatigue and made my way back to the house, brushing off the lingering unease. That night, sleep didn't come as easily. I tossed and turned, the stillness of the countryside suddenly feeling oppressive. The hum of the city, which I used to resent, had always been a kind of white noise that drowned out my thoughts. Here, every creak of the house and rustle of the wind seemed amplified. When I finally drifted off, it was only to be startled awake by a sound. Thump. I sat up, heart pounding. The noise was faint but distinct, like something heavy falling to the ground. I strained to hear, but the house had returned to its unnatural silence. Telling myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a raccoon knocking something over. I forced myself to lie back down. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The next morning, I found myself standing on the porch, staring at the field. My gaze locked onto the scarecrow, its cheerful face now seeming less friendly in the harsh morning light. Was it closer to the house? The thought struck me like a cold splash of water. I shook my head, dismissing it. I must have just been imagining things. The scarecrow hadn't moved. It couldn't move. To reassure myself, I walked out to the field, my boots crunching on the dry grass. I stopped in front of the scarecrow, studying it closely. Everything looked the same. Same overalls, same plaid shirt, same painted smile. But the ground around the post seemed disturbed, the dirt looser than it had been when I set it up. My stomach twisted. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself. "You're just tired." But as I turned to head back to the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The day passed slowly. I busied myself with chores, anything to keep my mind off the scarecrow and the strange thoughts creeping into my head. By afternoon, I decided to walk into town to pick up supplies and maybe talk to a few locals. Willow Creek was as small as I'd imagined, its main street lined with a handful of shops and a diner that seemed to be the town's hub. I stopped by a general store, its shelves stocked with everything from gardening tools to canned goods. The store owner, an older man with a friendly smile, greeted me warmly. "New around here?" he asked, ringing up my items. "Yeah, just moved in," I replied, returning his smile. "Bought the old McAllister place." His expression shifted, just for a moment, but enough for me to notice. "That's a good piece of land," he said, though his tone was cautious. "Anything I should know about it?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He hesitated, then leaned in slightly. "People around here have stories about that place. Nothing serious, just old folklore." "Folklore?" "About the scarecrow," he said, lowering his voice. "They say it's been there longer than anyone can remember. Some folks think it's just a scarecrow. Others—" He trailed off, shrugging. I laughed nervously. "It's just a scarecrow," I said, more to convince myself than him. "Of course," he said, though his expression remained unreadable. Walking back to the house, the weight of his words settled uneasily in my mind. Folklore or not, there was something strange about that scarecrow. By the time I reached the house, the sun was already dipping low in the sky. The field looked different in the fading light, more shadow than substance. The scarecrow stood at its center, a solitary figure against the vast expanse. I tried to push the unease aside as I stepped into the house, locking the door behind me. But as I settled in for the night, I couldn't help but glance out the window one last time. The scarecrow was there, just as I'd left it. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't alone. Night descended upon Willow Creek with an oppressive stillness that felt almost tangible. The air in the house was thick, heavy with an inexplicable tension that made every creak of the floorboards seem louder, every gust of wind outside more deliberate. I sat at the kitchen table, the journal I'd found in the barn splayed open in front of me. The dim light of a single lamp cast long shadows on the pages, and I found myself rereading the strange entries about the scarecrow, trying to make sense of them. It moved again. This time I'm sure of it. The dogs are restless, barking at nothing. I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I feel like it's watching me. My hands trembled as I turned the page. I tied it down today, used rope and stakes. But this evening it was standing straight again. I don't know how. I don't know why. I slammed the journal shut, my pulse racing. It was just a story, I told myself. Old folklore passed down through years of superstition. But when I glanced out the window toward the field, my breath caught in my throat. The scarecrow was gone. I bolted to the porch, the screen door slamming behind me. The field stretched out before me, bathed in pale moonlight, but the scarecrow's post stood empty. My eyes scanned the shadows, searching for any sign of it. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. No answer. The air felt charged, alive with a tension that prickled my skin. Clutching the flashlight I'd grabbed from the kitchen, I stepped off the porch and into the field. The dry grass rustled beneath my boots, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet. As I approached the empty post, a chill ran down my spine. The ground around it was disturbed, the soil churned as if something heavy had been dragged away. My flashlight beam followed the marks, leading deeper into the field. "Get a grip," I muttered, trying to steady my nerves. "It's just some kids messing around." But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. The marks led to the edge of the field, where the tall grass gave way to a small patch of woods. My light flickered as I stepped beneath the canopy of trees, the sounds of the night growing louder around me. A branch snapped to my left, and I spun toward the sound, my heart pounding. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice shaking. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, from the shadows, I heard it, a low, raspy laugh. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The laugh grew louder, more distorted, until it echoed through the trees like a chorus of voices. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run. But I didn't get far. Standing at the edge of the woods, blocking my path back to the house, was the scarecrow. Its painted face, once cheerful and bright, was now twisted into something grotesque. The smile had stretched unnaturally wide, the blue eyes glinting with malice. The fabric of its overalls moved as if alive, rippling like muscle beneath the surface. I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but the air around it seemed to vibrate with a menacing energy. "This isn't real," I whispered. "It can't be real." But it was. The scarecrow tilted its head as if studying me, and then it took a step forward. I stumbled back, my flashlight beam trembling as I struggled to keep it steady. "Stay back," I shouted, though I knew how absurd it sounded. The scarecrow took another step, and another, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. In a blind panic, I turned and ran deeper into the woods, branches clawing at my skin as I pushed through the undergrowth. The sound of rustling fabric and snapping twigs followed close behind, relentless and unyielding. I didn't stop until I reached a small clearing, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The flashlight beam darted around me, illuminating nothing but trees and shadows. For a moment there was silence. Then the scarecrow emerged, stepping into the clearing with an almost predatory grace. It stood there, its head tilting again, as if it were mocking me. I scrambled backward, my mind racing. There had to be a way to stop it. The journal had mentioned something about tying it down, but that hadn't worked for the previous owner. What else could I do? And then I remembered the fire pit. The fire pit behind the house had been one of the few things left in good condition. a sturdy metal basin surrounded by stones. If I could lure the scarecrow back there, I could burn it. The thought gave me a surge of hope, enough to steady my shaking hands. Slowly, I rose to my feet, keeping my eyes on the scarecrow. "All right," I said, forcing my voice to sound stronger than I felt. "You want me? Come and get me." I turned and ran, this time heading for the house. The scarecrow let out another raspy laugh, the sound grating against my ears as it gave chase. The woods blurred around me as I sprinted toward the edge of the field. My lungs burned, my legs screaming in protest, but I didn't dare slow down. When I burst into the open, the sight of the house gave me a second wind. I reached the fire pit and grabbed the matches from the small tin on the porch. My hands fumbled as I lit a pile of dry kindling inside the basin, the flames catching quickly and growing into a roaring fire. The scarecrow emerged from the field, its movements slower now, almost deliberate. It seemed to hesitate, its glowing eyes flickering as it took in the fire. "Come on," I muttered, gripping a large stick and holding it aloft. "Let's end this." The scarecrow stepped closer, its fabric starting to smoke as it neared the heat. I swung the stick, the flames licking at the scarecrow's arm and setting it ablaze. It let out a piercing shriek, the sound so inhuman it made my blood run cold. It thrashed wildly, the flames consuming it as it stumbled toward the fire pit. With one final guttural scream, it collapsed into the basin, the fire roaring higher as the scarecrow was reduced to ash. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, staring at the smoldering remains, my body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The oppressive tension that had hung over the property seemed to lift, replaced by an almost peaceful stillness. I didn't sleep that night, too afraid to close my eyes. But when the sun rose the next morning, the field looked brighter, the house warmer, as if the land itself had been freed from something dark. Packing the scarecrow's ashes into a metal box, I drove to the nearby river and dumped them into the water, watching as the current carried them away. As I stood there, the journal's final entry echoed in my mind. I hope the scarecrow does its job this time. Maybe it had, or maybe it had been waiting for me all along. Either way, I wouldn't be staying in Willow Creek to find out. And so, with the last loose end tied and the mystery of the scarecrow finally put to rest, I left the McAllister property behind, vowing never to return. The scarecrow was gone, its hold over the land broken. But as I drove away, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see it standing there, watching me leave. It didn't. But somehow, I wasn't sure that meant it was truly gone. My name is Evan Turner, and for the past 5 years I've worked the night shift at an old storage facility on the edge of Elk Grove, a small, sleepy town in the Pacific Northwest. The facility is massive, an endless grid of metal containers stacked 3 stories high, with narrow aisles that feel more like a maze. It's not exactly the kind of place you'd expect to find much excitement, but then again, I didn't take this job for thrills. Most nights are uneventful. I clock in at 10 p.m., lock the main gate, and spend the next 8 hours making rounds through the warehouse. My duties are simple: check for any signs of tampering, ensure the containers remain locked, and report any unusual activity to my boss, Rick, who's always asleep by the time I start my shift. Tonight started like any other. I arrived at 9:45, parked my beat-up sedan in the employee lot, and made my way to the security office. The night air was crisp, with a faint smell of rain lingering from a passing storm. The warehouse loomed ahead, its weathered metal exterior reflecting the faint glow of the floodlights scattered around the property. As I approached the office, I noticed one of the floodlights flickering. It wasn't unusual. Most of the equipment here was older than me, and maintenance wasn't exactly a priority for Rick. Still, the erratic buzzing of the light made the air feel heavier, almost oppressive. I pushed the door open and stepped inside the office, a cramped space cluttered with old furniture, a coffee maker that barely worked, and a desk piled high with paperwork no one bothered to organize. The security monitors lined one wall, showing grainy black and white footage of the facility. After logging in and checking the cameras, I grabbed my flashlight and began my rounds. The first patrol was always the easiest. The air was still relatively warm, and the warehouse felt more like a familiar workplace than the cold, hollow shell it would become by 3 a.m. The warehouse doors groaned as I pushed them open, the sound echoing through the cavernous space. Inside, the rows of containers stretched out before me, their towering forms creating dark alleys that seemed to swallow the faint overhead light. I flipped on my flashlight, its beam cutting through the gloom as I started down the first aisle. Each container was marked with a faded number painted in stenciled white letters. Some were dented and rusted, evidence of years of wear and tear. Others looked newer, their locks shiny and secure. As I walked, my footsteps echoed on the concrete floor, the sound bouncing off the walls in a way that made it impossible to tell where the noise ended and the silence began. Halfway through my first round, I noticed something odd. One of the container doors was slightly ajar. My flashlight's beam caught the glint of the metal latch hanging loosely, the padlock missing. A wave of irritation washed over me, probably some careless renter forgetting to secure their unit. I approached the container cautiously, my hand resting on the handle of the small utility knife clipped to my belt. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding far too loud in the stillness. No response. I peered inside, the flashlight revealing a cluttered interior filled with old furniture, cardboard boxes, and a collection of unmarked crates. Nothing seemed out of place, but the absence of a lock still nagged at me. Making a mental note to report it later, I secured the door and continued my patrol. As I moved deeper into the warehouse, the air grew colder, and the faint hum of the overhead lights became more noticeable. It was a sound I'd grown accustomed to over the years, a constant background noise that was strangely comforting. But tonight it felt different, like the hum wasn't just mechanical but alive, resonating in the walls and floor. At the far end of the facility, I came across something I hadn't seen before. Lying on the floor near a stack of pallets was an old lantern. Its metal casing was tarnished, the glass dirty and cracked in places. I knelt to examine it, running my fingers over the cool, rough surface. It felt out of place, like it didn't belong here. When I picked it up, a faint glow emanated from within, pulsing softly like a heartbeat. My first thought was that it must be a battery-operated lantern left behind by one of the renters, but there was no visible switch or power source. The glow wasn't bright, just enough to cast a dim light over the surrounding area, but it was oddly mesmerizing. I turned the lantern over in my hands, searching for an explanation. The metal felt strangely warm, and the faint light seemed to pulse in rhythm with my own heartbeat. Unease prickled at the edges of my mind, but I shook it off. It was just a lantern, I told myself. Nothing to be afraid of. Still, I couldn't bring myself to leave it behind. Something about it felt important, like it was meant to be found. I carried it with me as I finished my patrol, its faint glow illuminating the darkened aisles. By the time I returned to the security office, the night felt heavier, as if the air itself had thickened. I set the lantern on the desk and stared at it for a long moment. Its light pulsed steadily, casting long shadows across the walls. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't experienced since my first night on the job, a sense of unease, a nagging feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced at the security monitors, the grainy footage showing empty aisles and motionless containers. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, just beyond the reach of the cameras. The hours stretched on, and the lantern's glow never wavered. It was as if it was waiting for something, or someone. And as the clock ticked closer to midnight, I couldn't help but wonder if finding that lantern was a coincidence, or the beginning of something I couldn't yet understand. The clock on the wall ticked past midnight, its rhythmic clicking oddly loud in the silence of the security office. I leaned back in the rickety office chair, staring at the mysterious lantern on the desk. Its glow had neither dimmed nor intensified, still pulsing with the same hypnotic rhythm. Something about it gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. It wasn't just the way it seemed to come alive when I touched it, or how out of place it had felt lying there in the middle of the warehouse floor. It was the fact that it had no switch, no visible mechanism to explain its glow. The longer I watched it, the more uneasy I became. The faint, steady light seemed to draw the shadows in the room closer, making them stretch and dance along the walls. The hum of the overhead lights now felt like static, buzzing in my ears and blending with the faint thrum of the lantern. I tried to shake the feeling. I was a grown man, for crying out loud, not some kid scared of the dark. Still, the air in the room felt charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm, and the unease was beginning to settle deep in my chest. I turned my attention to the security monitors. The cameras showed the usual static images of the warehouse aisles, the grainy footage capturing the same lifeless stillness that defined my nights here. But as I scanned the screens, I noticed something odd. In one of the monitors, near the far corner of the facility where I'd found the lantern, the image flickered. For a moment, it showed nothing but static before the feed returned to normal. I leaned closer, narrowing my eyes at the screen. There it was again, a flicker of static, just long enough to make me question whether I'd really seen it. I switched to the next camera in the sequence, but the image was fine. Faulty wiring, I muttered, more to convince myself than anything else. It wouldn't have been the first time one of the cameras acted up. Still, something about the flicker bothered me. I grabbed my flashlight and stood, my boots creaking against the tiled floor. The thought of going back out there, into the dark maze of containers, made my stomach tighten. But I couldn't ignore it. If something, or someone, was messing with the cameras, it was my job to find out. I grabbed my radio from the desk, clipped it to my belt, and stepped outside. The cold night air hit me like a slap, carrying the faint smell of damp concrete and rust. The warehouse loomed ahead, its open doors spilling weak light onto the ground. The flickering floodlight I'd noticed earlier was now completely out, leaving the far end of the property shrouded in darkness. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and headed inside. The sound of my footsteps echoed off the metal walls as I made my way down the aisles. The containers loomed like silent sentinels, their shadowy forms creating a labyrinth that seemed to stretch on forever. I reached the area near the malfunctioning camera and stopped, shining my flashlight around. Everything looked normal. The same stacks of containers, the same narrow pathways. But the air here felt different, heavier. It was the kind of feeling you couldn't quite explain, like walking into a room where someone had just been arguing. I checked the camera mounted on the wall. It didn't look damaged, but the small red light that indicated it was recording was off. Great, I muttered, making a mental note to report it to Rick in the morning. As I turned to leave, a noise stopped me in my tracks. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but distinct enough to send a jolt of adrenaline through my veins. A soft scraping sound, like metal dragging against concrete. I froze, holding my breath and straining to listen. The sound came again, this time closer. My flashlight beam darted around the area, illuminating nothing but empty aisles and containers. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the stillness. No response. I took a step forward, my boots scuffing against the floor. The sound stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, the kind that pressed against your ears and made your heart pound louder. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, gripping the flashlight so tightly my knuckles ached. And then, just as I was about to turn back, the sound returned. It came from behind me this time, a low, dragging noise that sent chills racing up my spine. I spun around, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. For a moment I saw nothing, just rows of containers and shadows. But then something moved. At the edge of the flashlight's range, a figure stepped into view. It was tall and thin, its form distorted in the flickering light. It stood perfectly still, its features obscured by the shadows. "Hey," I called out, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "You're not supposed to be here." The figure didn't move. I took a step closer, the beam of my flashlight trembling slightly. "I said, you're not supposed to be—" Before I could finish, the figure disappeared. One moment it was there, standing at the edge of the aisle, and the next, it was gone. My heart thundered in my chest as I scanned the area, my flashlight darting back and forth. There was no sound, no indication of where it had gone. I backed away slowly, my instincts screaming at me to get out of there. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't human. Or if it wasn't playing by the rules of reality. I made my way back to the security office as quickly as I could without breaking into a full sprint. The shadows seemed to shift and twist around me, and every creak of the building felt like a threat. When I finally reached the office, I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it. My chest heaved as I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. The lantern was still on the desk, its glow steady and unchanging. But now, it seemed brighter, casting longer shadows across the room. I stared at it, the unease in my chest growing stronger. Whatever was happening in the warehouse, it had started the moment I'd found that lantern. I sank into the chair and ran a hand through my hair, my mind racing. I needed to call someone. Rick, the police, anyone. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was something they wouldn't understand. The lantern pulsed softly, as if mocking my hesitation. I glanced at the security monitors, hoping for some clarity, but the cameras showed nothing unusual. The aisles were empty, the containers still, and yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the room grew unbearable. Finally, I grabbed the radio from my belt and pressed the call button. "Rick, it's Evan," I said, my voice shaky. "We've got a situation here. I don't know how to explain it, but something's not right. I think you need to come down here." I released the button and waited. Static crackled on the other end, followed by Rick's groggy voice. "Evan? What the hell are you talking about? It's the middle of the night." "I know," I said quickly, "but this is serious. There's someone or something in the warehouse, and there's this lantern." I trailed off, realizing how insane I sounded. Rick sighed. "Look, I'll be there in an hour. Just sit tight and don't do anything stupid." The line went dead. I set the radio down and looked at the lantern again. Its glow seemed to pulse in time with my racing heartbeat, a silent reminder that this night was far from over. As I waited for Rick to arrive, the shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, and the faint hum of the lantern filled the air like a warning. Something was coming, and I wasn't sure I wanted to be here when it arrived. The warehouse had never felt more like a tomb. The air seemed thicker, like every breath I took was laden with something unspeakable. The shadows stretched further than they should, curling like tendrils, creeping into corners where the light should have kept them at bay. The lantern on my desk pulsed rhythmically, its soft glow now casting strange, angular shadows across the room. I leaned back in the creaky chair, trying to steady my breath. The sense of being watched hadn't left me, but the radio was silent, and Rick's voice felt like a distant echo. I had no idea how long it would take for him to arrive, but in this place, in this moment, it didn't matter. Time felt irrelevant, like I was suspended in some sort of nightmare. I ran my fingers through my hair, trying to gather my thoughts. The figure in the warehouse had been real. Whatever it was, it had been real. But the more I thought about it, the more the experience seemed to fade, as if reality itself was warping. I could almost convince myself it was just a trick of the mind, a play of shadows or a fatigue-induced hallucination. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The only thing I could trust now was the lantern. It had drawn me into this nightmare, and it seemed to have a grip on me now, tightening with each passing moment. I stood up abruptly, determined to shake off the suffocating sensation that had settled in my chest. I walked over to the desk, eyes locked on the lantern, willing it to reveal its secrets. I reached for it, my hand trembling, and as soon as my fingers brushed against the cool surface, a violent tremor ran through me. The room seemed to shudder, the light flickering violently. The hum that had been so quiet suddenly became deafening, and I felt the ground beneath me shift. My knees buckled, and I stumbled backward, grabbing the edge of the desk to steady myself. The air had thickened into something viscous, like it was being pulled down into some other dimension. The lantern's glow flared, and the shadows seemed to spiral inward toward it. For a brief, terrifying moment, I was no longer in the security office. The walls dissolved, and I was falling, plummeting into an abyss of darkness. I gasped, heart hammering in my chest, and slammed my eyes shut. I could hear the howling wind around me, feel the cold biting through my skin. I opened my eyes again, and everything was different. I was no longer in the warehouse. Instead, I stood in the middle of a vast, endless void, the space stretching out infinitely in every direction. The ground beneath my feet was flat and smooth, an empty, featureless expanse. The only thing visible was the lantern, floating in the air before me, glowing with an intense, unnatural light. A presence filled the void, something ancient and oppressive. It wasn't just in the air. It was in my very bones, resonating in the marrow. My entire body screamed for me to turn and run, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped in this place, surrounded by nothing but emptiness. "Help!" The whisper came from somewhere deep within the void, a faint, trembling voice that seemed to echo off every corner. I couldn't tell where it was coming from. Was it me, or something else? "Please, help!" The voice was clearer now, desperate, filled with pain. My pulse quickened as I recognized the voice. "Rick?" The lantern's light flickered. I stumbled forward, but the ground seemed to stretch further away with every step. The voice echoed again, now unmistakable. It was Rick, but it sounded wrong, distorted, twisted, as though he were caught in some kind of hell. "Rick!" I shouted, my voice swallowed by the emptiness. The lantern's light flared again, and suddenly, the ground beneath me cracked open. I was falling into a darkness deeper than anything I had ever known. I reached out instinctively, but my hands grasped at nothing. I fell through an endless abyss, my body weightless, as if time and space had ceased to exist. Then with a violent jolt, everything stopped. I opened my eyes. I was no longer falling. I was in the warehouse. The air was cold, too cold, but I was back in the security office, lying on the floor. My head throbbed and my vision blurred as I struggled to sit up. My fingers brushed against the ground and I froze. There, at the edge of my hand, was the lantern, still glowing with an otherworldly light. The shadows had disappeared, but the weight of the atmosphere had not. I blinked hard, trying to focus, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My mind raced, my thoughts incoherent. I needed to find Rick. He was still out there somewhere. I reached for the radio and clicked the button. "Rick! Rick! Are you there?" My voice trembled, but I couldn't help it. There was nothing. I gripped the radio harder, panic creeping in. "Rick, answer me!" Static. Then, "Evan." The voice was distant, distorted, but unmistakably Rick's. "Rick, where are you?" I asked urgently. "Evan, it's too late." The words were slow, dragging like a tortured whisper. "I saw it. I saw the thing in the lantern. It's too powerful. You can't stop it. You need to leave." I swallowed hard, my chest tight. I didn't understand. None of this made sense. "I'm coming to find you." "Rick, just hang on," I said. But the line went dead. The lantern's light flickered again, and for the first time, I noticed something in the reflection. Something moving. Something I couldn't quite make out, until it was too late. The shadows twisted. A shape materialized before me, long and thin, its limbs unnaturally long and bent at odd angles. Its face was a void of darkness, a shadowy mass that seemed to pulse with an unsettling rhythm. It was the same figure from before, the one I'd seen in the warehouse. It moved silently toward me, and my heart nearly stopped. My legs refused to move, frozen in place by an overpowering sense of dread. "You shouldn't have touched it," the figure rasped. Its voice wasn't human, but a twisted echo of something older, darker. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The figure's hand reached toward me, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Coldness flooded through me, and for a moment, I felt as though I was being pulled apart. "You belong to it now," the figure whispered, its voice like 1,000 voices in one. "There is no escape." The lantern's glow intensified, and everything around me, reality itself, began to warp. I felt my body being dragged toward the figure, my mind unraveling as it whispered things I couldn't comprehend. The shadows around me closed in, and the lantern's light became blinding, overwhelming. With one final scream, the light consumed me entirely, and everything went dark. Epilogue. The warehouse was quiet, as it always was. The hum of the lights overhead was the only sound that remained. The cameras showed empty aisles, the same empty containers, and the same stillness. But on the desk in the security office, the lantern flickered gently, its glow steady once more. And in the darkness, something shifted. For a brief moment, the faintest whisper of a voice echoed in the empty warehouse. "Help!" But no one was there to answer. My name's Jed, and I just moved to the quiet town of Ridge Hollow with my mom and little sister Daisy. Ridge Hollow is one of those places where every street feels like it hasn't changed in 50 years. Our house is small, a little worn down, but cozy. There's this huge oak tree in the front yard that Daisy loves to climb, and a rickety old fence that creaks whenever the wind blows. It felt like the perfect place to start fresh. The first night in our new house was quiet. Too quiet. I couldn't sleep because of how strange it felt. Back in the city, I was used to the hum of traffic and the occasional siren. Here, it was just silence. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling when I heard it. At first, I thought it was just the wind. A low, soft noise, like someone was whispering right next to my ear. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. It was coming from the wall behind my bed, the one that separated my room from the empty guest room. "Hello?" I whispered, feeling kind of silly talking to a wall. The whispering stopped. I waited a few more minutes, my eyes wide open in the dark. Maybe it was just my imagination. The next day, I didn't think much about it. Mom was busy unpacking boxes, and Daisy was running around the yard, pretending to be a pirate. She's 7 and has the wildest imagination. She even named the tree Captain Bark. That night, it happened again. This time, the whispering was clearer. It wasn't just noise, it was a voice. A man's voice, low and serious. I pressed my ear against the wall, trying to make out the words. "She knows," the voice said. "Why did she go in there?" "Go in where?" I pulled back, my heart racing. I wanted to wake up Mom, but what would I even say? That the wall was talking? She'd think I was losing it. Instead, I stayed up all night listening. The voice would start and stop, always whispering about someone. Sometimes it sounded angry, other times just sad. The next day, I decided to tell Daisy. She believed in ghosts and all kinds of spooky things, so I figured she wouldn't laugh. Her eyes went wide when I told her. "Do you think it's a ghost?" she whispered, clutching her stuffed rabbit, Mr. Floppy. "I don't know," I admitted, "but something's definitely weird about that wall." We decided to investigate. Daisy grabbed a flashlight and we sneaked into the guest room. It was mostly empty, just a few boxes and old furniture the previous owners left behind. I tapped on the wall where I heard the voice. Nothing. "I think you scared it," Daisy said. "Ghosts don't get scared," I replied. But honestly, I hoped she was right. For a few days, everything seemed normal. No voices, no whispers. I started to think maybe I imagined the whole thing. But then one night, I woke up to Daisy shaking me. "Jed, it's back," she hissed. I followed her into her room. The whispering was louder now, coming from the wall next to her bed. It was the same voice, but this time it sounded urgent. "Don't let her in," it whispered. "She'll never leave." Daisy grabbed my hand, and we both froze. I didn't know what to do. The voice kept repeating the same thing over and over. Suddenly, there was a loud knock at the front door. We both jumped. Who would be knocking at this time of night? I told Daisy to stay put and crept downstairs. The knocking continued, steady and slow. I peeked through the peephole but didn't see anyone. "Jed?" Daisy's voice was trembling behind me. She had followed me down, clutching Mr. Floppy. "It's okay," I whispered, even though I didn't believe it. I opened the door just a crack. The night was dark and the street was empty. No one was there. We shut the door and locked it, then ran back upstairs. The whispering had stopped. Daisy climbed into my bed that night, and neither of us slept. The next morning I told Mom everything. She didn't laugh or call me crazy. Instead, she looked serious. "This house has a history," she said. "The woman who lived here before us, she disappeared. No one ever found out what happened to her." Daisy and I stared at each other. "Do you think the voice is warning us?" Daisy asked. Mom didn't answer. But that night, we heard it again. This time, all three of us listened. The voice was softer, sadder. "Help her," it whispered. "Find her." We never figured out who the voice belonged to, but after that night, it never came back. Mom said maybe it had found peace. Daisy thinks we helped the ghost somehow. Me? I'm just glad we're not alone in that house anymore. And sometimes late at night, I still hear the wind whispering through the trees. Or maybe it's something else. My name is Corbin. I'm 12 years old, and I've always been curious about old places. That's why last summer, when my family moved to a small town called Meadow Hollow, I was excited. The town was quiet, surrounded by woods, and our new house? It was huge. Well, huge compared to our old apartment in the city. It had 2 stories, a creaky porch, and a big backyard with tall, swaying trees. The house belonged to a man named Mr. Amos. He had passed away years ago, and the house had been empty ever since. My mom said we got a good deal on it. I didn't really care. All I knew was that I finally had my own room and a backyard to explore. I spent the first few weeks exploring every nook and cranny. The floors creaked under my feet, and the walls seemed to hum when the wind blew. But I liked it. It felt alive. My sister Delaney thought it was creepy, but she's only 8, and everything scares her. My dad, on the other hand, loved the place. He's a carpenter, so he spent most of his time fixing things up. One Saturday, Dad asked me to help clear out the backyard. The grass was tall, and thorny bushes had taken over. We worked for hours, pulling weeds and cutting back branches. I found all sorts of cool stuff. Rusty nails, an old glass bottle, even a tiny metal key. But the weirdest thing I found was an old wooden box. It was buried under a pile of leaves near the back fence. The wood was dark and cracked, but it had a strange symbol carved on the lid, like a star with a circle around it. I wiped the dirt off and called Dad over. "Looks like an old keepsake box," he said, shrugging. "Probably belonged to Mr. Amos." I was about to open it when Delaney ran over, wide-eyed. Don't. What if it's cursed? I laughed. It's just a box, Lainey. Chill out. But when I lifted the lid, it wasn't empty. Inside was a small leather journal. The cover was faded, and the pages were yellowed with age. I flipped through it, curious. The handwriting was neat but shaky, like someone had written it in a hurry. That night after dinner, I sat in my room and started reading. The first few pages were boring, just notes about the house and the weather. But then, things got weird. The writer, who I guessed was Mr. Amos, talked about hearing strange noises at night. He wrote about whispers coming from the walls and shadows that moved on their own. At first, I thought he was just old and imagining things. But then I read something that made my skin crawl. I've locked it away, but it's still here, watching, waiting. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak and groan of the house felt louder, like the walls were listening. The next day, I showed the journal to Delaney. She read a few pages and gasped. "We have to tell Mom and Dad." "No way," I said. "They'll think we're making it up." Instead, we decided to investigate. Delaney wanted to stay inside, but I convinced her to come with me to the backyard. We searched every inch, looking for anything unusual. That's when I found it, a loose board on the fence. Behind it was a small hidden door. "Let's go back," Delaney whispered, tugging on my sleeve. But I couldn't. I had to know what was behind that door. I pried it open and crawled inside. Delaney followed, reluctantly. The space was small, just big enough for us to crouch. The air smelled damp, and the walls were covered in cobwebs. At the end of the narrow passage, there was another box. This one was bigger, made of metal, and it had the same strange symbol as the wooden box. I hesitated, my heart pounding. But I opened it. Inside was a photograph. It showed a group of people standing in front of our house. They all looked serious, except for one man, Mr. Amos. He was smiling, but his eyes looked wrong, like he knew something the others didn't. There was also a note. It read, "Do not disturb the quiet. It will wake." That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the note. What did it mean? What would wake? I tried to sleep, but the whispers started. Soft at first, like a breeze. Then louder, like someone was standing right next to me. Delaney ran into my room, her eyes wide with fear. "Do you hear it?" she whispered. I nodded. We spent the rest of the night huddled under my blanket, too scared to move. The next morning we told Dad. He didn't believe us, of course. "Old houses make noise," he said. "It's nothing to worry about." But it didn't stop. The whispers followed us everywhere. And then the notes started appearing. The first one was on the kitchen counter. "You shouldn't have opened it." Delaney cried when she saw it. I felt sick. We didn't tell Dad. He'd just brush it off again. The next note showed up in my room. "It's watching." I wanted to leave. I begged Dad to sell the house, but he laughed it off. "You've got an overactive imagination, Corbin." But I knew the truth. Something was in the house. Something old and angry. One night I heard footsteps outside my window. I peeked through the curtain and saw a shadow moving across the yard. It wasn't human. It was tall and thin, with long, spindly arms. Delaney and I didn't wait. We packed our bags and left that night. We went to a neighbor's house and called Mom. She came and picked us up, furious. But we didn't care. We never went back to that house. Dad stayed behind to finish his work, but he never talked about what happened. Sometimes, late at night, I think I hear the whispers again, and I wonder if we really left it behind, or if it followed us. Hi, my name is Sawyer. I'm 12 years old and I've lived in the same small town my whole life. It's quiet here. Nothing much ever happens. But something weird did happen last summer. something I can't stop thinking about. I know it sounds crazy, but I swear, every word is true. It started when my mom got a job at Pine Hollow Care Home. It's an old, creaky building just outside town. Mom is a night nurse there, working from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. She likes it because it's peaceful, and the residents are nice. But I always felt like something was off. One night, Mom had to bring me with her. It was supposed to be a quiet shift, and I'd stay in the staff lounge, reading or playing games on my tablet. She made me promise to stay put, but of course, I got bored after an hour. That's when I decided to explore. The care home has 2 floors. The first floor is where most of the residents stay, and it smells like lemon cleaner and old books. But the second floor? It's been shut down for years. Mom told me it used to be a place for people with long-term illnesses, but they closed it after a flood ruined most of it. I didn't expect to find anything interesting upstairs, but something pulled me there. The staircase creaked under my feet as I climbed up. The lights didn't work, so I used the flashlight on my phone. The air felt colder the higher I went, like stepping into a fridge. At the top of the stairs, there was a long hallway. The walls were peeling, and the floorboards felt soft under my sneakers. I should have turned back, but something caught my eye. A door at the very end. Room 12. I don't know why I walked toward it. Maybe it was the way the door seemed to shimmer in my flashlight beam. Maybe it was the faint humming sound I thought I heard. Whatever it was, I couldn't stop myself. When I reached the door, I saw a sign above it. The letters were faded, but I could still read them. Michael's room. That's when the air got even colder. My breath came out in little puffs, like it does on frosty mornings. My fingers were freezing, and my heart was thumping so loud I thought it might wake the whole building. I touched the doorknob. It was icy, like metal left out in the snow. When I turned it, the door swung open easily. The room was empty, or so I thought. The flashlight beam swept across old furniture covered in sheets. A broken wheelchair sat in one corner. The window was cracked, letting in a thin stream of moonlight. But the weirdest thing was the floor. There were wet footprints leading from the window to the middle of the room. "Hello?" I whispered. My voice sounded tiny, like it didn't belong to me. That's when I saw him. A boy, maybe a little older than me, standing in the shadows. His skin was pale, almost gray, and he was wearing a torn hospital gown. His head was bald, and his eyes, well, there were no eyes. Just smooth, blank skin where eyes should have been. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. The boy tilted his head, like he was curious about me. Then he smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. His mouth stretched too wide, showing rows of sharp, shiny teeth. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet. The flashlight slipped from my hand and rolled across the floor, its beam flickering wildly. I scrambled to grab it, and when I looked up again, the boy was gone. But the footprints were still there, now leading straight toward me. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back downstairs, but I did. Mom found me huddled in the staff lounge, shaking and pale. I told her I wasn't feeling well, and she let me go home early. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the boy's face, or where his face should have been. I decided to do some research. The next day, I went to the library and found old newspapers about Pine Hollow. That's when I discovered the story of Michael Crane. He was a patient in room 12, admitted in 1998 after a terrible accident. Michael had a rare condition that made his body super flexible, almost like rubber. He was known for being quiet and shy, but something happened one night. The article said Michael vanished from his room, leaving behind nothing but wet footprints. No one ever found him. I knew then that the boy I saw wasn't just a ghost. He was something else. A week later, I went back to Pine Hollow. This time I wasn't alone. My best friend Jace came with me. Jace is the kind of kid who isn't afraid of anything, or at least he pretends not to be. We brought extra flashlights and a bag of salt because Jace said ghosts hate salt. We waited until Mom's shift started and then snuck upstairs. The air was cold again, but this time I was ready. We made our way to room 12, stepping carefully over the creaky floorboards. The door was open, just like before. Inside, the room looked exactly the same, except for one thing. Michael was standing by the window, waiting. Jace froze. "Sawyer, what is that?" "It's him," I whispered. "Michael." Michael took a step forward, his feet leaving wet marks on the floor. His head tilted again, that creepy, curious tilt. "We need to go," Jace said, backing toward the door. But I couldn't move. Michael was looking at me. No, through me. And then, in a voice that sounded like wind through broken glass, he whispered, "Help me." That broke the spell. I grabbed Jace's arm and we bolted. This time I didn't stop until we were outside, gasping for air. I don't know what Michael wanted, and honestly, I don't want to find out. We never went back to the second floor after that. But sometimes, late at night, I think about him. I wonder if he's still up there, waiting in room 12, leaving wet footprints that fade too quickly. And I wonder if he's still calling for someone to help him. Hi, I'm Tommy, and I probably made the worst decision of my life a few nights ago. I agreed to house sit for my Uncle Jared. Uncle Jared is the cool one in the family, the kind who brings candy to family reunions and lets you watch scary movies when your parents say no. He has this huge house on the edge of town. It's old and creaky, but still, it's a nice place. Uncle Jared and his wife, Aunt Grace, were going on a cruise. "Just water the plants and bring in the mail," he said. "Easy job. You'll get paid and you can stay in the guest room." Sounded good to me. I was saving up for a new bike, and it felt like easy money. So, Friday afternoon, I packed my backpack with a few snacks, my favorite books, and my lucky flashlight. I wasn't scared. I'd stayed there before. Nothing weird had ever happened. Well, except for that one time their dog wouldn't go near the attic door, but that was probably because of a mouse or something. The first 2 nights were uneventful. I watered Aunt Grace's plants, she loves orchids, and watched some cartoons in the living room. I even found a box of Uncle Jared's old board games and played a few by myself. Everything seemed fine. Until Saturday night. It was around midnight when things got strange. I was lying in bed reading a comic book when I heard footsteps. They weren't soft, like a cat walking around. These were heavy, thudding steps coming from above me, the attic. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe the house settling. You know, like old houses do. But the footsteps didn't stop. They kept pacing back and forth, slow and steady, as if someone, or something, was walking up there. My heart started to race. I tried to ignore it, but then something heavy fell over. It sounded like a box had tipped. The footsteps got louder, and they weren't random anymore. It felt like whoever, or whatever, was up there was looking for something. I grabbed my lucky flashlight and crept out of the guest room. I didn't want to wake up in the morning to find something had fallen through the ceiling. I walked down the hallway, listening carefully. The house felt colder than usual. Every step I took seemed too loud, echoing through the quiet halls. When I reached the attic door, I stopped. It was an old wooden door with a brass handle that gleamed faintly in the moonlight. I stared at it for a long time, debating whether I should open it. Then the footsteps stopped. Just like that. Silence. I took a deep breath and backed away. If something wanted to come out of the attic, it could. But I wasn't going up there. No way. I tried to go back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing. What if there was someone up there? A thief? Maybe I should call Uncle Jared? Just as I reached for my phone, another noise started. This time it was coming from the garage. It sounded like someone was banging on the garage door with something heavy. Bam, bam, bam. Each hit made the whole house tremble. I jumped out of bed, heart pounding. The garage was just down the hall, connected to the kitchen. I tiptoed my way there, clutching the flashlight like it was a sword. The banging continued, louder and angrier. When I reached the door to the garage, I froze. There was a small window on the door, covered by a thin curtain. As I watched, a shadow passed behind it. Something, or someone, was definitely out there. I did what any sane kid would do. I locked the door. Then I grabbed the biggest kitchen knife I could find. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. The banging stopped, but the footsteps in the attic started again. This time they were faster, like someone running. I backed into a corner, clutching the knife and flashlight, trying to control my breathing. The attic stairs were just down the hall, and I could hear them creaking as someone, or something, descended. I needed to get out. But when I ran to the front door, I realized I had locked it earlier, and now, in my panic, I couldn't get the deadbolt to turn. My fingers were too slippery with sweat. The footsteps were closer now, just around the corner. I didn't wait to see who, or what, was coming. With a final twist, I managed to unlock the door, yanked it open, and bolted into the night. I didn't stop running until I reached the street. My uncle's house loomed behind me, dark and silent. But as I glanced back, I saw something. In the attic window, a face was watching me. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its mouth twisted into a grin that made my stomach turn. It wasn't human. I jumped into my bike and pedaled as fast as I could. My heart didn't stop racing until I was miles away. The next day, Uncle Jared called. "Hey, Tommy, you okay? The security system went off last night. The motion sensors were going crazy." "Motion sensors?" I asked, confused. "You never told me about those." "They're new," he said. "We installed them after the last house sitter disappeared." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What happened to them?" "We don't know," Uncle Jared admitted. "The police never found any evidence. But the house, it's strange. Things move on their own. Sounds come from places they shouldn't. I'm sorry, Tommy. I should have warned you." I didn't say anything. There wasn't much to say. I was just glad I had gotten out. But one thing's for sure. I'm never going back to that house. And if you ever get asked to house sit for someone with a big old house, maybe think twice, because sometimes when a house creaks and groans, it's not just the wind. Sometimes it's something else.